The South African mediascape has been captured by a coalition of right-wing and neoliberal forces with key online publications firmly under neoliberal control. Now, that is according to an opinion piece recently penned by co-founders of the Pan-African Institute of Socialism, political activist Phillip Dexter and Roscoe Palm. And in the article, they go on to allege that some South African media outlets are not as objective as perhaps they should be, and that there are some foreign influential elements that actually drive these narratives. So for a discussion on this, we're joined by Phillip Dexter, co-founder of Pan-African Institute of Socialism. Phillip, thanks so much for being with us and welcome to Morning Live.
Morning.
So firstly, what motivated you to write this article?
Well, it's interesting. We founded this institute a few months ago and walked into a storm, basically. I mean, we had a meeting in the office of an online publication called New Frame. And we didn't know this, but it was in the process of closing down. There then followed this massive uproar between the staff at New Frame, some of the staff, who alleged that the funding for New Frame was somehow dirty money and that it included Chinese state funding. This allegation was then carried over, and Amabungani published an article in which they basically made these allegations. This was in spite of the fact that they interviewed us, and we told them, quite frankly, we had no such funding, Chinese funding, and neither did New Frame for that matter. And it brought us to a point where we decided to have a look at who funded them, since they were asking these questions. And that revealed some very interesting things to us. Because, we know private media is funded by the shareholders, business interests, and obviously they have a particular bias. But these independent or so-called independent publications are parading themselves around as if they are somehow, able to provide objective news. But when you look into their funding, it comes, some of it, via various front organizations from the US State Department, some from the Open Society Foundation, some from the Oppenheimer family, and, various other sources. And when you look at the narrative that they project, it's quite obvious that they are protecting or advancing particular interests. And we believe very much that they are advancing the interests of what we'd call the neoliberal or imperialist agenda in our country.
So one of the buzzwords in South Africa is, of course, capture. So are you saying that these media institutions, these outlets are captured by those who are funding them?
Certainly. I think that, as I say, they project themselves as independent. But when you look at their editorial policy, when you look at the line that they push in, I mean, I'll give you the example of the Ukraine-Russia conflict as one, but also China. The Amabungani journalist, Mika Reddy, openly pronounces that there's a Chinese imperialist agenda in Africa, and at the same time criticizes us for saying that there's an American or an imperialist agenda in Africa. So, it's this double standard that we see in their reporting and the articles that they produce.
Phillip, these are, of course, very serious, very scathing allegations that you make. So in terms of evidence, what sort of evidence do you have to basically back up these allegations?
Well, some of it's on their website, where they announce who their funders are. And they're quite open about, for example, Open Society Foundation money, which comes from George Soros, who's a notorious neoliberal, one of the most reactionary people that one can find politically. And then some, as I say, there's various organizations that purport to be independent. But when one looks at them and you go behind them, you'll see that money comes from via various organizations from the US government. And that's used for training journalists, that's used for, funding various things that they do. And, the fact is that it's all very well for them to say they declared their funders and they put up on there that, the Oppenheimers give them money, for example. But those organizations that we're talking about, there's a company called Illuminate, there's another institute for media, they all receive their money ultimately from the US government.
So the funding is one thing. Is there necessarily a straight line that connects the funding to the actual narrative of capture?
Well, of course, that's hard to prove. But we certainly believe, if one looks at the articles that they write and the thrust of what they're doing, that there are certain key trends in it. I mean, whilst on the one hand, they've been very good at investigating things like state capture here, there's also a tendency for them to argue that, corruption is, black people are corrupt. You don't see them investigating the white businesses and white individuals. The other narrative, as I say, is this Chinese imperialism narrative. And, there are a couple of things like that one sees as threads that go through what they publish. And we believe that this does show that there's an agenda. And then there's, of course, what they don't publish. For instance, Daily Maverick, the editor of Daily Maverick, when one of the people who was named in this article penned a critique of what was written, the editor actually phoned her ex-husband and demanded of him that he tell her not to publish this article. This kind of censorship that one sees. I mean, apart from the fact that it was a patriarchal intervention, phoning somebody's ex-husband and saying to them, tell your wife to shut up. Apart from that, the mere fact that he could do that shows you that this claim to objectivity that they make is simply false.
So we remember the days of the New Age and all the brouhaha around that. And we all knew what it was about, whether you agreed with it or not. However, the question of funding has been one that has been on the table for a long time. You take a publication like Daily Maverick as an example, and many people have asked over quite, a few years, what is the funding model of the Daily Maverick? How do they actually sustain themselves? Did you manage to get answers on that?
Well, yes and no. As I say, they do publish what they say is their funding on the website, but it does beg some questions, and we're trying to do further research. And I think we're going to make an application under the Access to Information Act, because whilst it says there Open Society Foundation, it says Brenthurst, I think it is, or the Oppenheimers, but we've heard that behind that, there's additional funding that they've been receiving. They, of course, do receive from individuals as well. And the point is that we're not saying people shouldn't take donor funding. One of them has made this point that without donor funding, many of these publications would close down. And we believe that's true. And we don't want them to close down. We want, a variety of publications so that we get all different points of view. But if they're not coming clean about their funding, then I believe that that's cause for concern. And we as the public need to know. I've made the point that they demand, for example, that politicians must declare their income. But they don't declare theirs. They demand, various things of us in terms of transparency. All we're looking for is that there should be no double standard, that everybody should know what the playing field is and who's paying the piper at the end of the day.
So many South Africans would ask, so what is the actual inherent danger in all of this? In the article, you also reference on the rocks off the record, which speaks to the former U.S. ambassador to South Africa, Lana Marks, and some of the activities that she engaged in. Perhaps, Phillip, if you could just relate some of that so that we can take our viewers with us in speaking to this point.
Well, yeah, that was very interesting. The editor of New Frame, Richard Pataus, related a story to us. He said that, after the New Frame had been launched, he was paid a visit by Lana Marks, who just arrived on the doorstep, as it were, rang the bell with some of her entourage in tow, proceeded to invite him to this, what she called on the rocks and off the record briefing, which she said all the editors attended, she said. And it was a place where they would, be able to interact with each other. She would give a briefing, but the officials there would give a briefing from the US point of view, and that also it would be good for his career because there was funding and opportunities, to advance his career at this event. Now we've asked the question, has anybody else attended these things? We've only been, met with this kind of like derision and people attacking us instead of answering the question, were such briefings held? And if they were, who attended? Because once again, it's fine for them to attend those briefings, not a problem. But they should tell us if they're getting the story straight from the horse's mouth. And in this case, the imperialist horse.
So, and these briefings, one of the issues that obviously comes up here is that people would potentially be flown first class to live in very lavish accommodations. So this, again, something that we should be questioning.
Exactly. And I mean, again, as I say, there's no harm in people flying business class, no harm in them, drinking expensive whiskey down next to the sea. But we should be told, because if that's happening, it's going to influence the way in which they report on particular issues. And I think the other thing that relates to it is we've discovered there are a couple of individuals who are working in the various foundations that do fund and in some of the publications who actually come from the US government. One was posted in South Asia, the other in Afghanistan and Iraq, where they were, playing the role of briefing the US military. So those kinds of things should be made very clear to us as readers and as the public, so that we're able to make, our own informed decision about what it is that we're reading.
Have you heard back from SANEF post the penning of this article, Phillip?
No, we've yet to write to them because we're just doing some further research on a couple of the publications, the Mail and Guardian in particular, where we are also particularly worried about what we found there. So once we've done that, we will be submitting something to SANEF, and we'd also like to see some kind of a public inquiry into this.
So, Phillip, just in conclusion, so ultimately, what are you hoping to achieve and what message are you sending out?
It's simple. As I said, what we'd like to have is complete transparency, people acknowledging who their funders are, who are the people that influence the narrative that we see when we read these publications. Because, on the one hand, as I said, these people are making allegations, for example, about us that were unproven. They went off on a tangent, to say that we have not proved anything in terms of their funding. I sit here with Amabungani having accused us of being funded by the Chinese government. It's a complete and utter lie. But, there's no comeback, they don't apologize, and they leave it out there. And whilst on the one hand, I have no problem with being funded by the Chinese government, if I was, I would declare it. And all I'm asking is that they do the same.
Well, Phillip Dexter, thank you so much. Of course, I'm sure there will be a right of reply offered to these publications to hear their side of the story. Phillip Dexter is co-founder of the Pan-African Institute of Socialism and making some very, very serious allegations there. And as I said, we'll see if there are a right of replies accepted to come and tell us what these publications think. Because the article titled Drunk on Power, the Neoliberal Capture of the South African Mediascape by the US State Department. In it, it goes on to make these allegations about key online publications like News 24, Amabungane and Daily Maverick firmly under neoliberal control. So tell us what your views are as well at Morning Live SABC.